Hey everybody, today I'm going to fill a few pages in my sketchbook and take you along for the ride. All of these are rather simple ideas, and you can see that I already started with the first one, and in this video I'm focusing on the pages where I have already done one of the pages and now the other page on the spread is still empty, so I try to do something in a somewhat similar color scheme so it will at least somewhat fit together. I'm not completely limiting myself to the exact same color scheme every time, but just trying to make the pages match a little bit because that's what I prefer in my sketchbooks. So you can see that here I'm starting with a lot of green tones and warmer tones, yellow tones. I had a lot of purple in the picture on the left, but I didn't really feel like recreating the exact color scheme. But we do have the same green tones and some warmer tones in there as well. I'm using my White Nights watercolors and I really enjoy how bright and colorful and pigmented these are, and my palette has gotten a lot of use over the years already, so I might want to upgrade my colors at one point. I think I can buy them individually, so I will be looking into that. You can see that I started to fill the entire page with a lot of water, really just putting a lot of different colors on there, letting them bleed into each other, and then trying to get even more effects by adding in just a few dots on the wet spots, and also with a really wet brush, just adding a bit of water. Then I let that dry, and now we're kind of doing a negative painting where you paint around your subject. And here I am just doing some circles, so I'm using a darker color every time, also varying the color that I'm using. So I'm using different colors in this foreground as well, or it's going into the background rather, but on this layer we also have different colors, but every time I just make sure that it is darker than the one that I was using previously, so we get this kind of cutout effect that you can see here. And we have all of these circles. They're not perfectly round, and if you recreate this, yours don't have to be perfect either, because it is rather hard to get perfect circles with watercolors, especially when you're trying to do more of a quicker, loose painting. You could sketch your circles first if you want them to look more round, but I really didn't feel the need to do that. I wanted this to look a little bit more organic and fun and like a painting, and didn't have to look perfect. And also I didn't want to spend too much time on this because the whole idea of all of the pages that I'm doing today is that they're rather quick. These are meant to just loosen you up and get you started with art and just fill your sketchbook basically. So now you can see that I introduced gouache, and I'm using just white gouache. This is titanium white by Winsor and Newton. So this one is really opaque. If your gouache is not as opaque, you might be using zinc white, which is more for mixing. Titanium white is more for things like this when you really need to layer and get it to be really crisp and opaque. So it's really good for that, and I recommend getting a tube just of that if you do layer your white quite often. And you can see that I wrote some text on these bubbles that I did with the gouache. I wrote "Make the friendship bracelets" because currently I am making tons and tons of friendship bracelets. I have made probably around 60 so far, and I'm going to the Eras tour next year. I am so excited that I got tickets, and yeah, I've been making so many bracelets already, and it's more than a year. It's around a year until it's gonna happen. So yeah, we will see how many I will make, but this is the first page. If this tutorial is a little bit too fast for you, I recommend checking out my courses, which are a lot slower and go a lot more into detail. I have a very, very packed full and detailed course about gouache. I have a specific landscape tutorial that's much slower. And I also have a course about how to fill a sketchbook. And I am currently working on another landscape course that's not exclusive to gouache. So stay tuned for that and check out my courses. The link is in the description box below. Here I just dampened the entire page. I used just water for that. And then I went over with my brush, and you can see that I have two colors for each stroke. So I dipped my brush on one end of the brush, I dipped it into one color, and then the other I carefully dipped into another color. So we have two colors on here, and I just did a bunch of these swirls and I went over it again and again until I was happy with it. And since our page is wet or damp, it is going to run into the page, and this is just the first layer, so I wanted it to be a little bit more blurry, and this is kind of the effect that gives you, because the colors will slightly run into each other, and I also helped them blend into each other a little bit more. I colored in the spots in between those lines a little bit, went over that again, so just that we don't have these empty spaces anymore. Again, also added a few effects just with a wet brush. And now again with gouache, I am using my titanium white again, and I also used, I believe it's a magenta color that I mixed into it, and a little bit of a yellow color, so it's a very limited palette here. And I did more swirls, and this time they are fully opaque. You can't really see the swirls from the background layer as much anymore, so in hindsight I'm not sure whether I should have blended them less so they would be more visible. I don't know, I just ended up filling the page with the foreground swirls a little bit more. I might try this technique again in different ways and maybe just do the gouache, or we will see where it's gonna lead me. You can see that I'm using pink tones in lighter and darker colors. Some have more white and some are just magenta tones. And then I also mixed my yellow tone with quite a lot of white. So we have this very pale yellow color, and I just added a little bit more depth to everything, a little bit more color and detail. I also colored in this little corner, and then we're done with this page. Now for the next one, here again we already have something on the page on the right, and it has a lot of purple and a lot of yellow tones. So I went for a color scheme with mostly purple and pink tones here and a little bit of the warmer tones. And this is going to be this beach scene with a sunset in the background. And here I'm using this style where I'm leaving white lines in between all of the shapes. And I also did something similar on the page on the right. And I like to do this with watercolors or very wet mediums, because then you don't have to let every layer completely dry, because they're not touching, they're not going to bleed into each other if you want this style. So it is something that's rather quick, and honestly I enjoy the way it looks. I think this is a really fun thing to do, and landscapes like this are very quick because you just paint the shape and then you paint the next shape next to it, and all of them are a solid color. There's no layering involved, there's no blending involved, none of these things. So if you're looking for something quick then this might be it maybe. And this is really fun because you can do all kinds of landscapes and really simplify them. You can see that this is a really simple landscape now, and it is really not that hard to do, honestly. You just have to be somewhat precise with your shapes so that you can manage to leave the space in between the shapes and you don't accidentally let them touch each other. Sometimes that happens. I mean, mistakes always happen, but it is ideal if you can manage to always have this space in between and make that spacing somewhat consistent. And here you can see the finished page spread, what it looks like now. This was a really fun page to do. And then we have this one where there is a night scene on the right, and I wanted to stick with that theme and also have a nighttime scene on the left and have these very blue tones. And I wanted to stick with the same style or a similar one that I used with the other piece, because this is really enjoyable if you're doing something that is just where you don't really have to think too much, honestly, because here you really don't have to wait for each layer to dry. And that's something that is always a bonus, especially with watercolors. If you're using watercolors on watercolor paper, then they take a long time to dry. And sometimes that's a good thing, right? When you're doing wet on wet techniques, then that's amazing. But sometimes it gets really boring and I get really impatient. And I do have a heating tool, or you could also use a hair dryer to speed up the drying process. But sometimes that kind of messes with the drying of it and kind of pushes the paint around. And also, whether you're using a heating tool or a hair dryer, I find that it kind of disrupts my flow a little bit sometimes. And I also sometimes get overstimulated from the noise of the heating tool. So it's not always ideal. So if you're looking for something quick and simple, again, I think this is a good style to maybe go for. And you can see that I struggled with the paper on this page at certain points or in certain spots because I'm using Dorland's wax medium for my gouache pieces, and I had not sealed the one on the right yet, so that's not where the wax came from. It must have come from the other side, because the page spread that is behind the page that I'm painting on right now, that one was already sealed with the wax medium, and I think that I got the wax on the back page here, and that made it harder to paint with watercolors. Especially at certain points I mixed a little bit of gouache into my paint because I find that it's easier to paint on this kind of waxy surface with gouache than it is with watercolors, because watercolors have to kind of seep into your paper. They kind of soak into the texture of it, whereas gouache can sometimes sit on top of the paper. So yeah, I used a little bit of gouache here and there, but honestly I wanted to go mostly with watercolors here. And you can see that I am doing this nighttime sky, but in a very surreal way. We have these swirls, I have a moon and stars that I just left blank. Actually, we have two moons here, and I colored these in later on, and I'm just doing the same thing where I'm trying to get a somewhat even spacing in between these shapes. And I mean, sometimes the thickness of the spacing varies a little bit, but this is just a sketch in a sketchbook and a simple painting, so it really does not have to be the perfect spacing each time. And I was just building that up over time, all of these shapes. I did not have a plan for this piece whatsoever. I just painted and saw where it led me and where I would go. And I recommend doing this if you're looking for something that's more mindless and where you just paint, because sometimes you just want to have the paint flow over the page, but you don't want it to be a super sophisticated painting where you have intricate details and layers that you plan and where you have to think about what to paint first. This is something that's just built on itself. So you start somewhere in some corner and then you just fill the page. And yeah, you can see a bunch of the spots where I struggled with the paper. I don't know if it would have been a good idea to very carefully sand it down a little bit or roughen up the texture or maybe use some gesso or something. But honestly, at this point, it was already too late because I had already painted so much of the paper and it got increasingly worse towards the edges, which makes sense because I assume it came from the other page, so it mostly seeped through on the edges. So in conclusion, if you are sealing your sketchbook pages, be careful not to get whatever you're using onto the next page because it might make your life harder in the long run. And also maybe I would, if I find a page like this where this happened, I would use gouache instead because like I said, it is easier to layer over top of more waxy spots. And after I had finished this page spread, I sealed the page on the right because it is gouache. And gouache can, in certain cases, rub off your paper. I found that it really depends on the paper too, not just on the type of gouache that you're using. In this more rough paper, this is a watercolor sketchbook from Etchr, I find that the gouache paintings rub off much more than on smoother sketchbook pages for some reason. So I have to seal more of the pages with the wax medium, and I'm pretty happy with the wax medium generally, but yeah, I had some issues with it here with it seeking into this page. So here you can see this finished page spread with more of a nighttime theme. For more fun sketchbook ideas, check out this video next.